Here's what we know about the ancient world. Egypt built pyramids. Rome built roads. Greece wrote philosophy. We have their laws, their poetry. We know what Julius Caesar ate for breakfast. We know the name of the pharaoh's favorite architect. The ancient world left us an avalanche of paper trails, stone inscriptions, clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, centuries of human beings. No name you'd recognize, no founding myth written down, no royal decree, no tax records, no letters home from soldiers at the frontier. Nothing. Just silence. And yet at its peak, this civilization controlled territory stretching across an area larger than the continental United States. It moved goods across thousands of miles of maintained routes. It coordinated armies. It administered. It held together for generations, not through luck, not through isolation, but through genuine. Think about that for a second. We are talking about one of the largest political entities in human history, and it left no written records, none that we've found. Possibly none that ever existed. Your first instinct is probably the same one historians had for a long time. They must have been primitive. Writing is what separates civilization from prehistory, right? If they didn't write things down, they couldn't have been that advanced. That assumption is so deeply baked into how we think about history that most people never even notice it's an assumption. But it's wrong. It's not just wrong, it's backwards. The absence of writing didn't mean the absence of complexity. It meant something far more interesting was going on. Here's what makes this story genuinely strange. We know this empire existed. We can trace its edges through archaeology, through the accounts of terrified neighbors who absolutely did write things down, through genetic signatures left in populations across an enormous geographic range. The footprint is unmistakable. The power was real. The scale was staggering. But the empire itself chose, and this appears to have been a choice, to operate entirely outside the written word. No other political entity of this size in human history did that. Not one. Which means whatever was happening here was not a gap in development. It was a different system entirely. And once you start pulling on that thread, the whole story of what we think we know about civilization starts to unravel in ways that are genuinely difficult to put down. Here's what we actually know and how we know it. The man history remembers as Genghis Khan in 1206 AD on the steppes of Central Asia. At its height, it stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Western Europe. From the frozen forests of it was, by raw landmass, not the largest in mythology, not approximately the largest, full stop. And the Mongols at the administrative center of all of this produced almost no written records of their own. A document called It's real, it's extraordinary, and it was written after Genghis Khan's death, possibly decades after, almost certainly by someone outside the inner circle, and it was kept deliberately hidden from outsiders, which is exactly what the title tells you. It was not a system of governance. It was not bureaucracy. It was closer to a sacred oral tradition that someone eventually committed to paper in secret. That's not the same thing as a writing culture, not even close. So how did they run it? How do you coordinate military campaigns across 5,000 miles without a single written order? How do you administer tax collection across dozens of conquered civilizations without ledgers? How do you maintain legal consistency across an empire that contained more ethnic groups, languages, and religious traditions than existed in all of Europe combined? The answer is a system so sophisticated it should force a complete rethinking of what we mean by the word civilization. The Mongols operated through a combination of an elite that could move information across the entire empire faster than any communication system in the world at that time. A legal code called the Yesa transmitted entirely through oral tradition, and a culture of accountability enforced not through paperwork, but through personal loyalty structures that went all the way to the top. Genghis Khan himself was almost certainly illiterate. He governed the largest empire in human history without ever reading a single document. And it worked. For generations, it worked at a scale that literate empires with armies of scribes struggled to match. The absence of writing wasn't a limitation. It was architecture. It was a deliberate design choice built on a completely different theory of how power moves through people. And that choice tells us something uncomfortable about the story we've been telling ourselves about what civilization actually requires. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We know as much as we do about the Mongol Empire almost entirely because of their enemies. The Chinese wrote about them. The Persians wrote about them. The Russians wrote about them. Arab historians wrote about them. European monks wrote about them. Every civilization that came into contact with the Mongol war machine left detailed, terrified, meticulous accounts of what happened next. Cities destroyed, populations displaced, rivers in the 13th century described the Mongol conquest of Central Asia in language so extreme that modern historians spent decades assuming he was exaggerating. Then archaeologists started excavating the sites he described and found exactly what he said they would find: mass graves, burned grain stores, entire urban centers abandoned and never rebuilt. He wasn't exaggerating, he was underreporting. That's how we reconstruct the edges of an empire that left no center. Archaeology fills in what the terrified neighbors missed. Burial mounds across the Mongolian steppe have yielded weapons, horse equipment, and luxury goods from China, Persia, and Eastern Europe, all in the same grave, physical proof of a trade and tribute network spanning the entire known world. DNA studies conducted over the last 2 decades have identified a specific Y chromosome lineage present in roughly 16 million men alive today, spread across a geographic range that maps almost perfectly onto the boundaries of the Mongol Empire at its height. 16 million living descendants of a single patrilineal line. Geneticists believe this lineage traces back to Genghis Khan himself or his immediate male relatives. The man left no written records. He left 16 million genetic ones. Coin hoards buried during the Mongol expansion and never recovered tell their own story. Families across Russia, Poland, and Hungary buried their wealth and never came back for it. The distribution of those hoards maps the speed and direction of the Mongol advance with a precision no written chronicle could match. Fear, frozen in metal, underground for 800 years, waiting for someone with a metal detector and enough context to understand what they were looking at. And then there's the YAM. The relay messenger network that held the empire together has been reconstructed almost entirely through the 30 miles across the entire empire, with fresh horses waiting, riders changing mounts without stopping. He estimated a message could travel the full length of the empire in weeks. Modern historians have verified the station locations through archaeology. The infrastructure was real. The system worked. We know this because a Venetian merchant wrote it down, not because the Mongols did. What we're left with is a portrait assembled entirely from the outside. Every piece of evidence is a reflection. The empire itself remains almost completely dark at the center, and that darkness is not emptiness. It is a different kind of record, written in bones and coins and foreign nightmares, and the DNA of 16 million people who will never know why they carry what they carry. Here's the question that stays with you after you learn all of this. What else are we missing? The Mongol Empire is the largest example of a civilization that operated outside the written record, but it is not the only one. Across human history there are cultures, kingdoms, entire ways of organizing human life that left no text behind, and are therefore barely present in the story we tell ourselves about the past. We know about them the same way we know about the Mongols, through the accounts of people who feared them, traded with them, or stumbled across what they left in the ground. We know their edges. We almost never know their center. History as a discipline has a profound and mostly unacknowledged bias. It follows the written word. It goes where the documents are. And that means the civilizations that developed sophisticated alternatives to writing. Architectural encoding are systematically underrepresented in everything you were ever taught in school. Not because they were less significant, because they were less legible to the tools historians spent centuries developing. Think about what that means for the actual shape of human history. The story we tell is not the complete story. It is the story of people who wrote things down, told to other people who wrote things down, preserved in institutions built by people who wrote things down. Everything outside that circle is either silent or spoken for by someone else. The Mongols don't get to describe themselves. Juvayni describes them. The cities they conquered describe them. Their victims describe them. And those descriptions, however detailed and however verified by archaeology, are still somebody else's account of somebody else's interior. There is something genuinely humbling about that when you sit with it. The largest empire in human history is also one of the least understood from the inside. We can trace its borders through mass graves and genetic echoes, and the coins of people who buried their savings and never came home. We cannot hear it think. We cannot read what it believed about itself, what stories it told its children, what it thought it was building, what it imagined its own legacy would be. And here's what connects all of that directly to you, sitting here right now. The Mongol Empire existed. It was real. It shaped the modern world in ways that are still unfolding. Trade routes, population distributions, the political boundaries of a dozen countries, the genetic makeup of 16 million living people. And most Americans have never spent 10 minutes thinking about it. It is hiding in plain sight inside the history of everything else. The lesson is not just about the Mongols. The lesson is about what we choose to remember and what we allow to disappear. Written records are not history. They are one channel through which history sometimes passes. Everything else, the oral traditions, the memory systems, the architecture of accountability built entirely on human trust, that is history too. Most of it is gone. And the part that should stop you cold is this: we have no idea how much we lost before we knew enough to look for it.